I came to this country without anything other than a hope for a new beginning. I was happy as I got offered a job at Auto Haven Wreckers, a small scrapyard where bribed cops turned a blind eye for the somewhat shady business practices that took place. I didn't care. I had seen criminal activity up close in my homeland, and as long as I didn't get involved, I let things be. I just fixed cars and handled the crusher, something I did really well. A car went in, and a small metallic cube came out. It was not until one gloomy day that I, just by accident, saw some of the blood coming from one of the uncrushed cars. As I opened the trunk, I found a young man, gagged, with tied hands and panic-filled eyes. I freed the man, but he only managed to run 10 feet before my boss stopped him and slit his throat. I demanded answers, and Mr. Azarov explained to me that
you are nothing more than a simple executioner. More or less every car has a soul in it. This is a service a scrapyard provides to certain clients.
I snapped. I went ballistic. I threw him in the crusher and let it slowly compress. And as the head stuck out, I grabbed it and pulled the skull and the spine from the body. I left, and I was never seen again.
Welcome, friends and foes, survivors and killers. Let's sit around the campfire together and talk about Dead by Daylight. Specifically, about one of the 3 original killers who'd done a massive service by his Tome, Philip Ojomo, better known as the Wraith. Back when Dead by Daylight was but a baby Wii game, a piece of shovelware scraped out of the back cupboards of Starbreeze Games, the Wraith was one of the starting killers, alongside the Trapper and the Hillbilly. For a while, he wasn't what you'd call, good, but he received many gradual buffs over time until he became a fairly formidable killer, and in doing so went from one of the most loved by survivors to one of the most vehemently despised, pretty much overnight. But even when he was a bad killer, people still really liked him. So many, in fact, that when the 5th anniversary of Dead by Daylight came along, the developers released stats showing that the Wraith was the single most played killer of all time. Clearly our boy Philip's got a lot of loyal players who stuck with him even during the 4 years of the game where he sucked absolute donkey bollocks. And that really surprised me, at least at first, because you'd think of the 3 original killers, the Wraith would be the least popular. After all, the other 2 both have clear design inspirations that would draw people in who enjoy certain fantasies of what you want to do as a slasher killer. The Trapper is a Jason XB who enjoys being more of the conventional slasher, setting up traps and hanging people up with a machete, while the Hillbilly is more for the Texas Chainsaw Massacre enjoyers who would prefer all-out aggression. But the Wraith doesn't really fill out a similar pop culture idea, because he's actually got quite a unique design for a ghosty killer. Ghosts are probably up there with vampires and zombies in terms of being the most recognisable horror icons of myth and fiction. And yet I doubt you could think of many ghosts that the Wraith was obviously inspired by, at least visually. He hasn't got a bedsheet on his head, nor is he green or translucent, and he rings a bell to travel between the spirit world and the regular mortal world. It's clear that behaviours had stepped outside of the cliches and references that undercut Trapper and Hillbilly when they were making the Wraith. But unfortunately that same dedication was evidently not given to his story. Because the Wraith's original story was perhaps one of the worst in the game. Not only is it pretty limited in its scope, only showing us a tiny sliver of Philip's life, it's written in pretty sloppy English, like a lot of the old stories that were light translated from French, by someone who probably shouldn't be doing that job anymore and hopefully isn't. Despite how sloppily it was written, there's one thing that the Wraith story gave us that the Tome decided to really run with, and that's this little bit here. he had seen criminal activity up close in his homeland. But where is his homeland? And what criminal activity did he witness? Behaviour took this little soupçon of detail in his lore and decided to answer that question in Tome 4, and that's how we got the fantastic story that was the Algebra of Infinite Night. The Wraith story covers his childhood as he grew up in the horrors of the Nigerian Civil War between 1967 and 1970, and I'd argue was one of the best Tome stories we've ever had. Much like the Hillbilly, the Wraith story added some much needed context to his character and built him into a whole person, with his idiosyncrasies, emotions and personal history validated by weaving him into real life history. But before I go on, I'd like to talk to you about Exter, new friends of the channel that offer slim, safe and sophisticated card and ID protection. Exter's wallets allow you to stow your cards safely and access them quickly. The storage slot will protect your contactless cards from being skimmed without your knowledge, and this handy RFID tracker means that if you ever lose your wallet, you'll be able to find it again in no time. You can track your wallet via GPS and ring it remotely. You can even use your voice. And the tracker is solar powered, with 2 hours of charging giving you 3 months of use. And it all fits in a wallet about half the size of a typical bifold wallet. There's never been a better time than Exter's Black Friday sale to pick up an Exter wallet for a friend, a family member, or even yourself. And I'm here to help you with that. If you use my affiliate link in the description, you'll get an extra 5% off your purchase for a total of 40% off anything in Exter's store. I went for this Black Parliament leather wallet, but they've got a variety of colours and materials, including vegan leather and even carbon fibre. I've been using mine for the past week, and I cannot recommend it enough, so do go check Exter out. It would probably be advisable to actually discuss the war itself before we try to understand how it affected Philip and his character development prior to his arrival in America. So to help me, I've recruited a friend to give me a hand, who's a lot more knowledgeable about this than myself. An absolutely phenomenal creator, Solomon Troop. He's a stand-up guy currently working on the Auric Cell, a podcast about the killers and survivors dealing with the aftermath of the entity's death. It's really fantastic, and I don't think anything quite like it has ever been done before in the DVD community, so I heartily recommend you go check it out. Over to you, Solomon.
Hello, dear listeners. My name is Solomon. I make entertainment and analysis about Dead by Daylight lore, and I'm here to give you some cultural and historical context that enhances the Wraith's tome. So strap in, bitches, it's about to get juicy. And fucking depressing because, genocide. But mainly, juicy. Is it wrong to put juicy and genocide in the same paragraph? Anyway, if your knowledge on the Nigerian Civil War is low or non-existent, I wouldn't blame you. Like much of the history of Africa, Western nations don't spend a whole lot of time talking about it. But this war, also known as the Biafran War, is the setting for our favorite Bing Bong Boy, so it's important you know a little about how that war came to be. I promise this ties directly into how the Wraith is as a person, so please stick with me through this not-so-brief history tangent, okay? The most important thing to know is that there were 3 main cultural/ethnic groups of the then colony of Nigeria. The largest one was the House of Fulani, who controlled most of the northern part of the country. They were a very religious and socially conservative people, ruled under a feudalistic Muslim theocracy. They were elites, of course, but most of their people were farmers who valued prayer over education. Then there were the Igbo people. They were mainly Christian, egalitarian, and democratic. Their values were a bit like the motto today of, if you just work hard, success will come to you. And their entrepreneurial spirit, and the importance they place on education, backed the sentiment up. And finally, there were the Yoruba people, who for this particular story aren't really that important, but their notable qualities were that they were a bit of a mix between the 2 other groups. The somewhat happy middle ground. But in practice, they were often more aligned with the Igbos in values. Most of the Yoruba got along well with the Igbo, but the House of Fulani didn't fuck with either of them. But why did these tribes not get along? Well, mainly because of the British. Because it always comes back to the British. By uniting the northern House of Fulani with the southern Igbo and Yoruba, the British gave the vast majority of the political governing power to the House of Fulani. They did this because they believed the House of Fulani would be easier to control since they were generally less educated than the Southerners. The House of Fulani elites, in return, admired the British for granting them political privilege, and started to grow distasteful to the threatening level of ambition that the Igbo demonstrated. The Igbo were branching out, starting businesses, and voicing a growing desire to become a bigger part of the political system. This perceived threat of Igbo dominance was kind of based a little bit. I mean, they weren't like wrong, because of a coup that happened shortly after. This coup, coincidentally led by Igbo people, coincidentally took out a bunch of northern military leaders, and then coincidentally put a bunch of Igbo leaders in those now vacant seats, which uncoincidentally made the House of Fulani elites think the Igbo were kinda... After the failed Aburi Accord in 1967 to establish peace, the southern part of Nigeria, except for most of the Yoruba, seceded from the country. They declared themselves Biafra, and then Nigeria declared war on them in return. Taking a water break. My mouth is dying. That was me drinking water ASMR. Where was I? The conflict lasted about 3 years, which is way longer than it should have lasted for a number of reasons. Despite the strategic intelligence and blind optimism of their leadership, Biafra was definitely outgunned, outmanned, outnumbered, outplanned. Boom, 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 boom. If you got that reference, it's too late for you. And if you started singing along, it's really too late for you. They had military support from the British, who, again, are just the worst, no offense, Will, which is why I find it so ironic that the devs seem to ship the Wraith with the only British killer we have so far. But I mean, that's a topic for another video. It's a dicey topic. We're not gonna have that conversation today, okay? Alright, cool. The Brits didn't want Biafra to separate from Nigeria because if they did, they would lose easy access to Nigeria's resource-rich southern area. So they pumped money into the House of Fulani, who then blockaded pretty much all of the food from the Igbos. This led to the largest factor of death in the conflict: starvation. 2 million people would end up dying in this conflict, most of which from starvation. This prompted Igbo people to call Nigeria's blockade of resources, in effect, a genocide. And as the Western world got to see the pictures and videos that were circulating this event, they would start to agree and protest around the world. But just as it was looking like Biafra was going to have to give up and stop their people from dying in a war they couldn't win, the French intervened. Ah yes, the age-old classic. The lives of non-white people once again used as the battlefield for a pissing match between two Western powers. Where have I seen this before? The French wanted Biafra to secede so that their prominent oil company would have a foothold in the area, as well as to stick it to the British, probably. I mean, that's conjecture, but I've watched a lot of Italia, so I'm probably right. This move from the French and from the leaders of Biafra, who wouldn't let their Igbo pride be defeated, extended the duration of the war until it eventually ended in 1970. So, why did all this bloodshed have to happen? Well, money and power. And that's a part of how it ties back to Philip Ojomo. Ojomo? Ojomo? I don't actually... Maybe I should know that. Maybe I should know how to pronounce things. Anyway. This overbearing amount of cultural context I've given you is important because almost every area of Philip's character pretty closely ties back to either his cultural values growing up or his experiences he faced during the war. Think of it like this. The lessons Philip learned from his family are very Igbo. From his tome, we know that his father stressed the importance of education. He played chess with his son. He read him stories. When his grandmother wanted to shield him from the harshness of the conflict, she tried to get him to do math problems. His family didn't just want him to have a happy life, a complacent life. They wanted him to have one where he could get a better opportunity too. And we can see this Igbo intelligence manifesting in him later in the story too. Philip is a smart person at a young age. When he wanted to take revenge, he carefully considered all the options and picked the most efficient, albeit the most brutal, method of execution. And after surviving the war, he could have stayed in Nigeria, but he wanted more and decided to move to America. And as he's working at a very sketchy job in a very sketchy place, he chose to not get involved with the sketchiness. Which really, honestly, is kind of a black thing, but Philip's natural self-preservation and intelligence were bestowed to him because of the culture he was raised in. It's really smart character building on Behavior's behalf, and I really, really hope it was intentional when writing his story. Except, there's one small problem that kind of makes me think it wasn't. Philip isn't Igbo. He's House of Fulani. It's like directly stated in his lore.
They hate us. Why? Why do they hate us? Because the radio and the television tell them to. What did I ever do to them? You were born in newly created Nigeria. That's what you did. You were born a northerner.
So, Behavior canonically makes Philip a northerner, which geographically and politically makes him House of Fulani. You know, the super religious agrarian people who definitely did not spend a lot of time playing chess or doing math. And since most of the conflict of the Biafran War happened in and around the border of Biafra, him being a northerner means he wouldn't have even been near most of the conflict and war and devastation. His story seems to place him in the middle of the war, but his grandma's words put him far away from it. So, needless to say, this information, given all that we know about the three main regions of Nigeria, makes no sense and doesn't vibe thematically, like a lot of what Behavior writes, apparently. Listen, if Crow Girl can have crows even though there are no crows in South America, I can choose to ignore the whole House of Fulani thing. Philip is Igbo, and you cannot convince me otherwise. Facts don't care about your feelings, you dirty liberal. So, disappointment aside, there is just so much to the Wraith that I could talk more about. But I feel like I'm dragging the script out a bit, so in this section, I will simply posit some things that you can think about later. Some lightning round style dramaturgy I found out about when researching the Wraith. Okay? Cool. Here's some food for thought, Wraith edition. Wraith food for thought number 1, there's the fact that his bell, and ogene, is a staple of Igbo music in Nigeria. What was once a reminder of safety and family is now a reminder of the reason he's in the entity's realm, which is so sad. Wraith food for thought number 2, there's the fact that when he reappears and disappears, he's engulfed in flames and smoke, much like he was when he made those soldiers disappear. Wraith food for thought number 3, there's the fact that he hates men who kill for money in Nigeria, but when he goes to America, he works for Azarov, who makes him kill for money, therefore becoming the thing he hates the most. It's so thematically cool. And Wraith food for thought number 4, there's the fact that he's based on the Grim Reaper, and death seems to follow him no matter where he is in life. Even death is not an escape as he enters the entity's realm. It just works so well. I mean, there is just a lot to unpack here. And I feel like the lore community, all 2 of us, tend to sleep on how much intrigue there is with Philip's story. He is so fucking complex and interesting, and goddamn, I wish I could play him better, but I'm just shit at this killer, even though he's supposed to be easy to play. Why am I so bad at this game that I've played for 3 years now? So, where does this leave us with Philip? Well, it leaves us with a character who is incredibly shaped by his environment, both in the macro and micro sense. It gives us a whole lot more depth and complexity to a character whose original origin story didn't give us enough to work with. So now, when I play the Wraith in-game, I can feel extra bad for him. And extra bad at him. And you can too. Okay, that's all from me, folks. Hopefully I've left you with something new to think about, and I actually play the Wraith in the Orexcel podcast, which you should all listen to because we worked so hard on it, and it's great DVD entertainment. Thank you. Please stream our shit. Will's in it. Speaking of which, back to Will.
Yeah, what he just said. Jokes aside, the choice by Behavior to focus on Philip's past in Nigeria rather than his time in America under Azarov's employ was absolutely the right call. It's clear that Philip from the start was always intended to be Nigerian in origin, what with his Ogene Bell being such a clear piece of Igbo culture and music. So showcasing his time in Nigeria was a natural progression of his Tome story. He didn't really have a life after his time at Azerov's, and we know what happened when he was there. So the only place left to look to fully understand who Philip Ojomo is before his arrival at Azerov's. By developing his character as a child around his grandma Abby, our eye into Philip's formative years lets us both get to know Philip as he grows throughout the story and become emotionally invested in his well-being. Abby's loss hits so hard because we've just seen her looking out for her grandson and trying to keep him safe, and her absence affects him just as much as her presence does. One thing I really like about this story is that it understands that when it comes to disasters in their own lives, children aren't stupid. Despite Abby's attempts to protect Philip from the realities of the war, she can't preserve that childhood innocence for long, no matter how hard she tries. Philip understands that his family is gone and his grandmother's lives are at risk, and is aware that his grandmother is lying to him to try to spare his pain at the loss of his parents. But what really augments the authenticity is how the actual wider political context isn't really discussed at all. There's no massive exposition dump so that the readers can grok the context, which keeps us firmly in Philip's shoes for the narrative's duration. If they'd given us a crap ton of exposition that a child wouldn't logically know or care about to give us the full political landscape around Civil War, it would have broken us out of the story and taken away from the small enclosed narrative of Philip's personal nightmare. And the small world of Philip and Abby doing math problems in the dark only gets smaller when his grandmother's kindness and mercy gets the better of her. When she hears a young boy outside their bunker crying for help, she doesn't think twice about coming out to help him, only for the militia outside to take her away, leaving Philip alone. Only after Abby is gone and the last vestiges of Philip's childhood innocence are shattered completely does the core theme of the algebra of Infinite Night rise truly to the surface: survivor's guilt. After Philip leaves the bunker and finds his father's charred body, he's racked with an incredible guilt that he'd failed his job as a lookout, that all the blood spilled in the village is on his hands. And as he wanders from ruined village to ruined village, the weight of that guilt piles heavier and heavier on his shoulders, to the point that he doesn't think it's worth carrying on his life anymore. It's only the timely intervention of Funanya, a local woman who did survive with her children, that saves Philip from going off the brink of despair. As she exhorts him to join her and live another day, Funanya takes on a more grown-up and adult version of the role his grandmother played. She's his symbol of survival, of hope that maybe he can rebuild his life despite his guilt, that maybe the storm has passed. She's the angel on Philip's shoulder trying to calm him down and help him move on from the ideas of revenge, and to her credit, it almost works. But the devil's men came back, and Philip fails to protect Funanya and her children from them once again. Funanya's forgiveness in her dying breaths only amplifies that survivor's guilt. In Philip's mind, he doesn't deserve her forgiveness, and feels even more guilt as a result of that. It's the snowball of guilt in action. The more other people try to forgive you for your own wrongdoing, the worse you often start to feel, because you feel like you're getting forgiveness that you haven't earned, making you feel like a deceiver who doesn't deserve the friends you have, and making you even more miserable. The only way to overcome guilt is not to have others forgive you, but to forgive yourself. And Funanya spends the last seconds of her life telling Philip that. Forgive and be forgiven. But this is a story about growing up. And one of the most important lessons you can learn growing up is that you're not the centre of the universe. It's not all about you. And that's a lesson that, despite his guilt, Philip cannot forget. Just because he hasn't forgiven himself for his part of the deaths of those around him, doesn't mean he's forgotten who's really responsible. The mercenaries and soldiers who destroyed the villages in the first place. The angel on his shoulder is gone as he thinks about how he should deal with them and take his revenge. And in a move foreshadowed by the constant references to kerosene and smoke in the story, he decides to burn them away. And what happens next? Well, I'll just show you. At the end of the story, Philip's growth arc is complete, and I'll be honest, he hasn't really gained anything. His family and everyone who ever cared for him is dead. He's scarred both physically from the burns and emotionally from the guilt of the trail of bodies left in his wake. That day, Philip Ojomo became the Angel of Death, bringing burning vengeance onto the men who killed for money. But that's never who he wanted to be. Philip's aspirations were simple. He just wanted to live in safety, to love and be loved, but that got taken away from him at a cruelly young age. Maybe if he was an adult already, wise to the deceits and brutality of the world, he would have been able to have more of his own agency, put up more of a fight before it was too late. But he was a child. He should never have been involved in this conflict that should never have happened in the first place. And his innocence, his growth being so badly mangled from the horrors of the Civil War, followed him to America and Azarov's junkyard. Solomon addressed this earlier, but it's worth reiterating. Philip's burning hatred was directed at men who killed for money. So the fact that that's what Azarov had tricked him into doing must have reared up that same combination of incredible guilt and incandescent rage. Philip Ojomo has always been the wrong man in the wrong place at the wrong time. He's never had a chance to get out of the shadow of the violence that defined his childhood. Every single time he tried to make a fresh start and move on, he finds himself with blood on his hands through no real fault of his own. No wonder the entity saw him as a suitable killer. His life had been defined by being unable to escape from the bloodshed of his past, and now he has nothing to look forward to, except the same bloodshed defining his future. And Philip's story shines a light on an area of history that many of us will be largely ignorant of. How many people do you know who are even aware that Nigeria had a civil war, much less what started it or who was on what sides? This isn't old history either. Far from the Meiji restoration of 19th century Japan and the Oni story, there are a great many people who grew up during the violence of the Nigerian Civil War, and their stories must live on. The Wraith's lore update in Tome 4 is one of the best in Dead by Daylight's history for that exact reason. A single character, a single moment in his life when he killed Azarov, that's great and all, but it's a snapshot. A single moment in a life too complex to be defined by one moment. The algebra of Infinite Night instead strung together several moments, to build Philip's character from the components his original lore left behind, and wove him seamlessly into an area of history that way too many of us are way too ignorant about. And all of that in a character who, for a long time, was relegated to a poorly written bio and a sad face on the menu screen. Not bad, Philip. Not bad at all. You might be invisible, but nobody's going to overlook you anymore. Before we sign off for today, I'd like to give another quick thank you to Exeter. Again, if you're interested in picking up a wallet or card holder from them, do use my affiliate link in the description for an additional 5% off during their Black Friday sale. It goes a long way to supporting the channel and gets you some nice drip in the process, so it's a win-win really. Shout out as well to Solomon for his fantastic insights on the Wraith. The link to his channel is also in the description, so you can check out the Orexcel podcast, which I heartily recommend you do. It truly is a fantastic project. The next video will be covering the new killer, Carmina Mora, better known as the Artist. Her story is very complicated and has a lot of associated context. Her video is shaping up to be a big one, but hopefully it'll be worth the wait. In the meantime, you can join my Discord server, follow me on Twitter or Twitch, and even check out my Patreon and Ko-fi links if you feel like my content is worth your money. That's all from me for today, and I'll see you next time. Ta-ta for now.